If you think you're having a bad day, think again, because nothing, absolutely nothing, compares to what men faced in Stalingrad. This wasn't just a battle, this was the end of the world, brick by brick, breath by frozen breath, a place where time slowed down and death became routine. It was the worst place on earth during the Second World War, maybe the worst place a man could ever be. Stalingrad didn't just kill, it stripped men of everything: hope, warmth, sanity. The cold alone could stop your heart in the night. Starvation hollowed out entire regiments, and the enemy was everywhere, above you, below you, hiding behind the next ruined wall with a bayonet or a bullet. Even hell might have seemed kind in comparison. Compared to this, the beaches of Normandy were paradise. Compared to this, Verdun was organized. Stalingrad was chaos, pure, relentless, grinding chaos, and those trapped in it were left to fight, starve, and die in a city of ghosts. Over the past 5 years, I've read countless accounts from the Battle of Stalingrad. Letters, diaries, memoirs, fragments of memories left behind in the ashes. Today, I want to share some of the worst and some of the most powerful ones with you. These stories come from many different perspectives: young, old, broken, defiant. Some I'll narrate in the voice of the soldier himself to bring you closer to what he saw and felt. Others I'll tell in third person, especially when the details are too fragmented or intense to fully capture in first person alone. Either way, what you're about to hear is real. These are the voices of Stalingrad. What you're about to hear is the first-hand account of Gotfried von Bismarck, a young German officer thrown into the nightmare of Stalingrad. His story takes us from the final flights into the doomed city, to the bitter cold of the steppe, to the last desperate days of the encircled Sixth Army. It is a rare glimpse into the crumbling front lines, the starvation, the hopelessness, and the psychological collapse of an army abandoned. In his words, you'll hear not just what happened, but how it felt. This is Stalingrad, seen through the eyes of a soldier who lived it, and who knew by the end that the war was already lost. In late August 1942, our 178th Regiment broke through the northern bridgehead over the Don at Wertiachi. Against fierce Russian resistance, our panzers managed to claw their way to the Volga, just north of Stalingrad, within a few days. By September, our 76th Infantry Division had dug into the so-called northern boundary, a barren stretch of steppe between the Don and Volga. The land was dry and desolate, carved with deep gullies and ravines. We fortified the line with a network of double trenches connecting our bunkers, laid 6 rows of mines and barbed wire, and even positioned the wrecks of knocked-out Russian T-34s, still with functional turrets, as static tank defenses. We felt untouchable there, convinced that we were safe, that the Russians couldn't possibly break us. But inside Stalingrad everything was different. The fighting devolved into a savage man-to-man, floor-to-floor, house-to-house nightmare. The Soviets were entrenched on a steep slope just 300 meters wide along the western bank of the Volga, and it was here, in this tiny strip of land, that chaos reigned. The battlefield was so narrow, heavy weapons were useless. We could never fully take this ground, because no matter how hard we fought, the Soviets never stopped resupplying it across the river. It was war at its most absurd. Once I visited a company where Germans held the cellar and upper floor of a building, while the Russians occupied the ground floor in between. Neither side would destroy the house, afraid to lose their position or warmth. By night there was a silent agreement, a ceasefire to retrieve the wounded and bring in food. By day, the knives were out again. As a horse-drawn unit, We were unprepared for the brutal winter. There was no shelter for the animals, no wood for warmth or bunker construction. Everything had to be transported hundreds of kilometers from west of the Don. We sent most of our horses back across the river, keeping only a few for supply carts. That decision would cost us everything. When the Soviets finally encircled us, we had no way to move our heavy artillery. It was the beginning of the end. By November, the front had grown oddly quiet, and we were granted leave again. I drew the Christmas slot, but an older reserve officer begged me to trade. His daughter was marrying on Christmas. I agreed. A soldier takes what he can get, and I had no illusions that Christmas would still exist by the time I returned. On November 15th, I boarded the train at Kalach, the last station before Stalingrad. 4 days later, on November 19th, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. On the 22nd, the 6th Army was encircled. I spent 4 peaceful weeks at home in Pomerania. It would be the last time I'd ever see it. The German press said nothing. No one, not my family, not the command centers, knew the catastrophe that had just unfolded. If anyone at the reserve battalion in Potsdam had known the truth, they would have kept me from going back. But ignorance gave me no reason to stay. On December 14th, I boarded the eastbound train from Berlin. At Kharkov, we were ordered off. All 6th Army personnel were to disembark. Officers to the Führer Reserve, we were told. No one explained what that meant, but the whispers had begun. Something was terribly wrong at Stalingrad. Still, we told ourselves the 6th Army couldn't possibly be encircled. It was unthinkable. At Rostov-on-Don, the rumors of a pocket became louder. I was reassigned as liaison to the Romanian army. But the Romanians were already gone. What little remained had fled in panic, leaving everything behind. On December 23rd, our ragtag group of 40 officers and a few soldiers arrived in Chir, 280 kilometers from Stalingrad. There, we were ordered to form a Kampfgruppe to defend the town. There were 6 officers for every 1 soldier, and our only weapons were pistols. Most of the men were supply troops, drivers, cooks, stable hands, men with no combat experience. It was pure madness. We camped in the only shelter we had, our train cars. Thankfully, they were heated. No enemy came. No orders arrived. There wasn't even a real front, just open steppe and dread. On Christmas Eve, we saw an ambulance train passing by, loaded with wounded men, the last survivors flown out of the Stalingrad pocket. Their bodies were gaunt, lying in wagons packed with straw. Watching them, I suddenly remembered the Christmas tree my mother had packed for me. In a moment of pure instinct, I set it up on the frozen platform. We lit candles. The wounded, the walking, and the forgotten gathered in silence. Slowly, voices joined together to sing Silent Night. It was raw, off-key, yet deeply human. For a moment, in the freezing dark, hope flickered. The following days felt like a farce. We played at soldiers. I remember a patrol where 4 officers, armed only with pistols, scouted an icy road in an Opel. Another patrol used a locomotive driven by Russians, rolling east with fuel tankers, praying the Soviets wouldn't bomb us from above with their rickety night planes, the dreaded sewing machines. On December 30th, I received new orders. I was to return to my division inside the pocket. Most of the officers were now dead, and the unit needed replacements. I was glad to be going back to my own men, even if they were trapped. I had no doubt we'd break out. The idea that it could be hopeless simply didn't occur to me. Before flying out, I visited the staff office. There, I recognized Alexander Stolberg, my sister-in-law's cousin, now personal adjutant to Field Marshal Manstein. He welcomed me warmly and invited me to see the Field Marshal. During the meeting, I said I was heading back to the so-called front. Manstein cut in. "What do you mean, so-called front?" I told him plainly. That night, to my surprise, he invited me to dine with him and his staff. He later referenced that supper in Lost Victories, and Stolberg recalled it too, calling my actions a mark of Prussian duty. That sounds noble, but the truth? I was just a soldier with orders. The next morning, I was taken to the airfield. My flight, a Heinkel bomber, was overloaded with bread, ammunition, and jerry cans of fuel. The airstrip was little more than a frozen meadow. As we tried to lift off, the overloaded undercarriage gave out. The aircraft skidded hundreds of meters on its belly. Miraculously, it didn't explode. We climbed out unharmed, covered in dust and cold silence. I was offered a chance to skip the return flight into the Stalingrad pocket. "We'll have a coffee at Kranzler's instead," the Luftwaffe officer told me. That was the moment my so-called Prussian devotion to duty was truly put to the test. I declined, and I showed up right on time for the second takeoff attempt. It was a small flight group, 3 aircraft, no fighter escort, none were available. We were deep in Soviet-controlled skies when Russian fighters pounced. The other 2 bombers were hit and quickly discarded their supplies before veering off, not even attempting to land. Our aircraft pushed on and touched down, but we had no time. The Soviets had the airfield zeroed in. Every time a plane landed, shells followed. The order was clear: land, unload, load up the wounded, take off again. Stay on the ground for even a minute too long, and you were dead. I saw men crushed by crates of frozen bread, hurled from aircraft in haste. The cold turned everything hard as iron. I scrambled clear and got out fast. I must have been one of the last officers flown in. A few days later, that airfield fell to the Red Army. I made my way to Divisional Command, delivered Manstein's message. "The situation is miserable, but not hopeless." My commanding officer told me never to repeat those words. I refused. I believed it was wrong, insulting, to lie to men who already knew they were dying. That night, I was sent to the front. My regiment had thrown up a makeshift defensive line 30 kilometers west of Stalingrad. Of the original officer cadre, only 6 of us remained out of 45. I was handed a battle group of about 30 men. My predecessor had been seriously wounded the day before. No one from my old pioneer unit was left. They had all fallen. The men I now led were strangers. They were scattered across shallow trenches, dug under a meter of snow, in open, frozen steppe. We could only move when clouds masked the moon, creeping between positions at night. Our old fortified lines were gone, occupied by the Soviets. We, in turn, were lying in open, wind-blasted plains, trying to carve shelters out of ice and earth at -15 to 20 degrees Celsius. We lit our crude bunker with rigged telephone cable and covered it with salvaged aircraft parts. If food came, it came at night. If it didn't, we scavenged or went without. In the 6 weeks I'd been gone, the entire picture had changed. The 6th Army was starving. Supplies from the air were never enough. Rations dwindled day by day until there was practically nothing. The wounded lay in agony, untreated. There were no bandages, no painkillers, no morphine, no heat, no hope. If a man could crawl, he would drag himself to the airstrip, fighting with others to board a plane, often by force. Scenes of horror unfolded daily. Fistfights, pleading, begging. But even the fuel the planes brought in wasn't enough to get our remaining tanks moving, let alone save lives. Ambulances stood frozen and useless. We hauled the wounded by sledge when we could. Our horses, what few remained, were dying in the snow, too weak to pull, too few to eat. But worst of all, worse than the cold, the hunger, the sickness, was the silence in the ammunition boxes. There was nothing left to fire. Each round of artillery needed divisional approval. A Russian attack was no longer a matter of if, but when. And when they came, we would be nearly defenseless. That was the reality of Stalingrad by early January 1943. No fuel, no food, no medicine, no bullets, no hope of relief. And yet somehow the men still fought. On 8th January, I turned 22. 2 days later, it began. A massive Soviet offensive slammed into our northern sector. We held for a day, nothing more. Then they broke through. We withdrew, inch by inch, back towards Stalingrad, always under cover of darkness. One half of the men slept, while the other half kept the Russians at bay. On the retreat, every abandoned vehicle was searched, every seat, every crate for food. If a tin of meat was found, our unit would suddenly triple in size. In the night, I couldn't tell who was mine. We hauled the wounded on makeshift sledges. We couldn't do more. We didn't have the strength. Every night, we debated whether to try to break out to the west. But I knew how far the German lines were, hundreds of kilometers of frozen, enemy-held land. No shelter, no food, and our bodies had long since been stripped of strength. Some tried anyway, none made it. We never talked about becoming prisoners, but we all knew it was coming. We'd seen Soviet POWs before, those long columns of hollow-eyed, starving men shuffling in the dirt. None of us wanted to believe we might soon look like that, but we knew. By late January, the pocket had split into three. There were no more functioning airfields. At night, supply planes dropped containers of food blindly. Whoever got to one first kept it. Many fell straight into Russian hands. On 31st January, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. A day earlier, Hitler had made him a field marshal and ordered him to fight to the last man. We, in the north, held out. That night, in the ruins of a gutted house, we sat in a basement and listened to our own obituary, Goering's grand speech over the radio. He compared us to the Spartans at Thermopylae, proclaiming our sacrifice as heroic. "Wanderer, tell Sparta," he said. That was it. That was our send-off. We knew then we were already dead in the mines of Berlin. A whole army, sacrificed, for nothing. The bitterness was unbearable. And then, on the 2nd of February, it ended. The shooting stopped. The Soviets took prisoners quietly. No violence, no retribution. It was as if both sides had finally had enough. We were sick of war, sick of snow, sick of the dying. It was over. This is the first-hand account of Michael Daimel, a flight mechanic who bore witness to the Battle of Stalingrad, not from the trenches, but from the skies above. Over the course of 81 missions, Daimel flew through flak, fighter attacks, and bitter cold, dropping bombs in the early days, and later bread and fuel to a starving army trapped below. He saw the last moments of Potomnik and Gumrak airfields, and watched desperate wounded men fight for a place aboard his aircraft. What follows is his story of survival, loss, and duty carried out to the very end, above a city that had become a graveyard. After my missions over the Caucasus and the Black Sea, it was in the skies above that cursed city that my war would change. My 139th flight began on the 21st of August 1942. That morning at 6:30, we launched our first bombing run against Soviet troops. We flew again that afternoon from Kramatorskaya airfield, west of Stalingrad. Over the following days, the attacks intensified. On the 23rd, we transferred to Morosovskaya. By the 24th, our orders were clear. Begin concentrated bombing of Stalingrad itself. 3 missions that day, 06:30, 11:30, and 15:15. Each one a high-level strike over the city's rail yards, industrial plants, and urban districts. Every time, we were met with heavy anti-aircraft fire. From that point until early October, our crew, under Sergeant Major Dietrich, flew mission after mission, 58 combat flights in just 6 weeks, each lasting 2 to 4.5 hours. We launched from Kramatorskaya, Morosovskaya, and later Tazinskaya, each time pushing toward the burning heart of Stalingrad. In the Kalmuk steppe, northwest of the city, there was a gorge we named Grachi Valley. It was teeming with Russian forces, and we were ordered to bomb it repeatedly. Over and over again, daylight raids against Soviet troops hiding in those ravines. At times, it felt like we were trying to bomb the earth itself into submission. We attacked the city's railway stations, armament factories, and even airfields east of the Volga. Fighters and flak were constant. Our aircraft often came back damaged, but somehow none of my crew was ever wounded. We flew again and again and again. I remember one night in particular, my 196th mission, October 2nd, 1942. We took off from Kramatorskaya in our Heinkel Hay-1 11 at 20:45. By 2300, we were east of the Volga, hunting enemy airfields. Searchlights pinned us. AA guns opened up, but miraculously we took no hits. But our radio receiver was dead. We couldn't hear our base. Our transmitters still worked, so they could hear us, but we had no idea where we were. We flew blindly into the black. Lieutenant Winkler, our observer, shouted to the pilot, "Willie, turn west, or we'll fly straight into Ivan's hands." But with fuel running low, we gambled on flying south instead, hoping to find the Sea of Azov. By 4:30, we saw it, dark water under a pale dawn. But we didn't have the fuel to reach our own airfields. We circled, found a meadow 15 kilometers north of Berdyansk, and made an emergency landing. We kept the landing gear up. A regular landing on the narrow road below could have killed us all. We skidded across the field, cold and alive. Then came the long march back to base. That October, our pilot was transferred. Our crew disbanded. Losses had gutted the unit. I was held in reserve. After a brief furlough in December, I returned to the front and joined a new crew under Corporal Adrian. I was flight mechanic. We were now flying only supply missions. The 6th Army had been encircled. Our role had changed. Bring food in, bring the wounded out, if we could. My first mission with the new crew, my 198th flight, was on January 12th, 1943. We flew out of Novocherkassk in a He-111 at 7:45. We landed at Pitomnik airfield 2 hours later. What we found there stayed with me. Wounded German soldiers in filthy uniforms, barely conscious. Men from the organization taught too, mostly middle-aged, light olive uniforms. They'd been trapped while repairing roads to the city. We unloaded food containers. One private had come all the way from Germany just to deliver spare parts. We gave out sacks of bread. 8 wounded men and a war correspondent climbed aboard. Despite being riddled with AA holes, 50 shells had torn through the tail and rear fuselage. We managed to take off again and return safely. But that airfield would fall just days later. After Pitomnik was lost, on January 15th, we had only Gumrak left, but that field was a graveyard, shell craters everywhere, burned out wrecks, fuel shortages. Even so, orders from Field Marshal Milch came down hard. Landings must be made. Our group, 3rd Staffel of Kampfgeschwader 55, was down from 27 crews to 12. On January 18th, only 3 of us were still operational. That night, with temperatures at minus 20 degrees Celsius on the ground and minus 40 degrees Celsius in the air, we drove to Novocherkassk airfield. Sergeant Major Lochner muttered on the ride over that he had a bad feeling. He wasn't wrong. We took off in our He-111 at 2040, reached Gumrak by 2200, tried to land, but there was wreckage blocking the strip, a dead aircraft just sitting there in the dark. We lowered the gear, circled, then retracted, again and again, 8 times, 10. We never got the signal. We couldn't land. Eventually we opened the lower hatch and began pushing out the bread bags one by one, standing over the freezing wind blasting through the floor. Another crew did the same. A third never came back. On the next mission, 2 nights later, the same chaos. We circled for 90 minutes, fuel running low, no place to land. We dropped supplies from the air again and returned. Though we'd followed logic, we had disobeyed orders and were forced to file a written report. No one responded. Day missions were forbidden now. We would have seen the destruction clearly by daylight. Perhaps we could have landed, but they didn't allow it. After Gumrak fell on January 21st, we were left with a final option, a makeshift emergency strip near the heart of the city, Stalingradsky. We flew there on January 22nd. The scene that greeted us broke whatever was left inside. Soldiers in thin uniforms stood silently in minus 30 degrees Celsius cold, frozen together in hunched, unmoving clusters. We unloaded bread and containers as quickly as we could. One anti-aircraft officer came to us with a will in his coat pocket. He asked to hand it off to the last machine leaving. The next day, when we landed again, he was gone. We couldn't shut down the engines. There were no warming trucks. We drained fuel straight from our tanks to give the vehicles on the ground a chance to move. Of the hundreds of wounded there, we could only take 5 aircrew survivors of a downed aircraft. That was all we could carry. We flew to Stalino next, reloaded with infantry munitions packed in bomb casings, returned and dropped them to our encircled troops. On the morning of January 23rd, we landed again at Stalingradsky. While unloading, Russian fighters appeared. They opened fire. I leapt out and returned fire with an MG-15. Somehow none of us were hit, none of the wounded were struck. But then, amidst the rush to get clear, there was a sound, a dull, sickening thump. We turned and saw a body falling, headless, near the rotating propeller of the left engine. Blood soaked the landing gear, just blood, no other remains. A field gendarme nearby went pale. We found and identified the body. There was a moment of silence, but no time to mourn. The Russians could return at any moment. We forced ourselves to keep unloading, pushing past the grief with cold hands and colder hearts. 8 wounded men were loaded onto the aircraft. So many others we had seen the day before, faces we now recognized, had to be left behind. There was one I remembered especially. His arm in a plaster cast, eyes scanning us with quiet hope. Once again, he was passed over. As we prepared for takeoff, Adrian told me to get out and check the tail. One of the elevators had been bent during landing after striking hard-packed snow that stood nearly 40 centimeters high. I opened the lower fuselage hatch, dropped down into the frost, and made my way to the rear. I bent the metal back into shape by hand, numb fingers working quickly. As I climbed back inside, I caught movement. Someone had slipped in behind me. It was a wounded soldier. He stood frozen in fear, his eyes wide, desperate, silently pleading with me not to say a word. He knew we were full. He knew he wasn't meant to be there. But in that look, half panic, half surrender, I saw a man who no longer feared death, but feared being left behind. I nodded and said nothing to Adrian. By the time we lifted off at 10:45, we had been on the ground for 90 minutes. We saw no other aircraft during our time there. Whether more landed after us, or if we had truly been the last, I will never know. What I do know is that later that same day, the Russians overran the Stalingradsky Strip. The final German aircraft had left the city. In the days that followed, we continued flying. Between 24th and 29th January, we carried out 7 more missions, dropping containers packed with bread, fuel, and ammunition into the collapsing pocket. Our last drops were on the night of the 28th and early morning of the 29th. We flew our He-11 out of Novocherkassk, made the drop at 300 meters, low enough to hit our own lines, and then flew east over the Volga and Kalmyk steppe before climbing to altitude on the return. By then, the center of Stalingrad was in Soviet hands. The southern pocket was still fighting, and the northern one was shrinking by the hour. On our final flight, we received radio confirmation from within the pocket that the supplies had reached our men. It was little comfort. We all knew it was too late. I flew 81 missions during the Battle of Stalingrad, 59 bombing and attack flights, 22 supply and evacuation operations. Every one of them is recorded in my flight log, handwritten records, still in my possession to this day. We were required to document every sortie, every target, every outcome. Those logs tell a story in numbers, but the memories, they are something else entirely. There were many times I narrowly escaped death. My third crew, under Corporal Peter Adrian, the same man who flew with me into the pocket, was shot down on 5th March 1943 near Marefa, outside Kharkov. The aircraft crashed in flames. No one survived. I wasn't aboard that day, sick with fever. Sergeant Major Ramsberger had taken my place. He died instead of me. This is the voice of Eitel Heinz Fenske, an 18-year-old telephonist caught in the eye of the storm as the Soviet offensive swallowed the German 6th Army. From a quiet communications post to the roaring inferno of encirclement, his story traces the collapse from within. He witnessed the Romanian lines disintegrate, reported directly to generals like Paulus and von Seydlitz, and was torn apart by shrapnel as the sky rained fire. Frozen, wounded, and barely alive, he was carried out of Stalingrad, wrapped in paper sacks, one of the few to escape the grave. His account is not just one of survival, but of horror, loss, and the quiet, brutal decisions made by soldiers too young to die and too stubborn to give in. It was just before midnight on the 17th of November, 1942. The cold was deepening by the hour, and the moon cast an eerie glow across the steppe. At 10 p.m, I was on duty at the battalion field telephone switchboard, scheduled to be relieved at 0200 hours. The lines were quiet, no interruptions, just the usual background hum of war. But some of the frontline companies began reporting something strange. Loud engine noise, a deep mechanical growl rolling in from the distance. I left my post briefly, stepped into the cold, and listened. It was there, distant, but unmistakable. I reported it to the adjutant, and then, just before 200, the horizon erupted. A thunderclap of artillery and Stalin organs tore into the Romanian 3rd Infantry Division to our left. The noise was unlike anything I'd ever heard, pure hell pouring from the sky. Under the full moon, we could see it all. Sheets of fire rippling forward, smashing trenches and command posts alike. The Romanians broke and ran, their black sheepskin coats making them look like a swarm of ants scattering under flame. Tanks and tracked vehicles followed, rolling straight out of the Kletskaya and Serafimovich sectors. Infantry poured in behind them. Horse-drawn carts dragged up mortars and crates of ammunition. The spearhead of the Soviet offensive had arrived, and it wasn't stopping. 2 days later, on November 19th, a message came in from the 44th Infantry Division. I passed it to our battalion commander without delay. The 6th Army is surrounded. The Stalingrad pocket is a fact. Our orders were to pull back. We dismantled the switchboard, loaded everything onto our horse-drawn wagon, and left. As a linesman, I had been issued special winter clothing, grey, green and white, reversible anorak, padded with cotton flock for insulation. Alone on the steppes repairing wires, you needed more than a rifle to stay alive. That suit likely saved my life more than once, not just from the cold, but from what was coming. On the retreat, we passed a massive supply depot. It was overflowing, stacked with equipment, rations, clothing, everything we hadn't received for weeks. Infantrymen rushed the gates. Sentries tried to block them with raised rifles, but a few brave men stepped forward and made it very clear, stand aside or die. The guards vanished. Inside, men stuffed their greatcoats with cigarettes, cognac, whatever they could carry. I bypassed the luxuries and filled the legs of my suit with tins of Portuguese sardines, each can with its little metal key. I also took 2 bottles of cognac. I figured if this cold didn't let up, a drop of spirits in melted snow might keep my heart beating. It wasn't just looting, it was survival. Bread became scarce. A tin of sardines a day, rich in oil and fat, was the only thing keeping my body from freezing. On 21st November, Russian cavalry, supported by infantry, attacked our new line at Verchnaya Businovka. If the 177th Self-Propelled Battalion hadn't been with us, we would have been finished. They held the line, tank by tank. By the 23rd, our new front line was somewhere near Golobayatal and Ludzienskoye. I was ordered to scout the area and send back reports by radio. At Akimaski on the Don, I crossed a wooden bridge built by our engineers and moved west into villages that seemed already half abandoned. Romanian troops were wandering without weapons. Most had already given up. As night fell, I found shelter in the upper floor of a small house. I lay down with my rifle in one arm, my radio pressed to the other, watching the Romanians around me. I didn't trust them. I kept wondering, will they rob me? Will they kill me in my sleep? But when dawn came, everything was still in place. I could have escaped then. I knew German units were still west of the pocket. I could have posed as a straggler, slipped across the lines, and disappeared. But I turned around and crossed the Don again, back into the furnace. I found my battalion, reported what I'd seen. Our commander asked if the division could break out across the bridge. In theory, yes, but in reality, no. A short time later, I was summoned. A group of senior officers stood before me, among them General von Seydlitz and Field Marshal Paulus. Gefreitefenske, report what you have seen, they ordered. I laid it out clearly, the situation at the Don Bridge, the road, the Romanian collapse, the grim reality. That bridge would later be destroyed by our own pioneers. The Russians used its remains to come for us again. We held a new line at Baburkin. On our flanks were the battered remnants of the 134th and 132nd Regiments. The 177th SP Battalion kept Russian armor at bay, destroying nearly 100 T-34s in under a month. Without them, we were finished. On December 4th, the Soviets launched another massive armored assault. We repelled it. We counterattacked Hill 124.5. I moved forward with the assault and caught a ricochet in the left wrist, a steel fragment. My hand swelled up like a melon. I cut it open with my knife to let the blood drain, then pressed the wound against the cold hull of an armored vehicle. That ice saved my hand. Then came 12th December. At sunset, we attacked to plug a Soviet breakthrough. It was 1700 hours. A shell hit 100 meters to our left, another 50 meters to our right. The third landed directly on top of us. I saw a bright flash, lilac-colored light, and then silence. When I woke up, I couldn't move my right side. It was minus 40 degrees Celsius. I thought, this is how I die. I'll freeze here. There were 7 of us. Now only one other was breathing, and barely. My body was shredded with 48 shell fragments, embedded from shoulder to thigh. I was 18 years old. And then, a sound, a horse snorting, a quiet voice giving commands. A sledge passed close. I shouted. It stopped. A German voice asked if anyone else was alive. I said, "Only one more. He's gurgling." We were dragged onto the sledge and taken to an airstrip, unloaded into a cold wooden hut, and treated that same evening. I had blood poisoning, sepsis, gangrene in my leg. The army doctor, a junior surgeon named Heidinger, refused to amputate. He took the risk. He cut, drained, and cleaned the wound. I kept my leg, but the damage would remain for life. That Christmas, the Russians called a kind of ceasefire. Our medics stuck cotton balls on thistle branches and called them Christmas trees. We were given a half bar of Belgian chocolate, a splash of champagne, and Hitler's voice over the radio, "Stop work." Rest on December 28th, I was selected for evacuation. We were sealed into long paper transport sacks, layered like giant envelopes, so we wouldn't freeze at 50 below zero during the flight. First, they sent the married men with children. Then the rest of us, if there was room. Hours passed. The hut emptied. I lay alone in my sack on the straw, thinking they had forgotten me. Then I heard engines. It was the medics. They had come back. We took off in the dark, a short flight to Salsk. There we were unloaded into a vast hall, once used to store supplies for the front. Now it was empty, cavernous, but warm. There were bunks, blankets, tea, bread. I was treated right away. My infected thigh was flushed. I was given Maravinil Prontosil, 10 to 20 huge pills every day. They saved my life. But it wasn't over. Rumors began to spread. The Russians were advancing again. Salsk would fall within days. We were loaded onto a hospital train and moved to Rostov into a converted school building. Beds with real sheets. Food we couldn't finish. Medics in grey Red Cross armbands. Old men drafted into service. Worked alongside military surgeons and even Russian women, some nurses, some doctors. One of them, a young Russian doctor, examined me. My fever was back, blood poisoning again. There was no blood left in storage, and I was fading. Someone asked, "Where do we get the blood?" This is the account of Wilhelm Gerke, a German artilleryman who witnessed the final collapse of Stalingrad from the front lines to the prison camps. From his position near the Volga, he watched the Red Army close the noose, saw command posts fall one by one, and stood among the last defenders before surrendering in the frozen ruins. But his true ordeal began after the fighting ended, stripped of everything, marched barefoot through the snow, and packed into death trains, bound for the camps of the Volga steppe. This is not a story of victory. It is a story of survival, of watching thousands fade in silence, and of returning to life when all hope seemed buried. This is Wilhelm Gerke's testimony. Our number 2 battery had already been split, half the men were on leave and hadn't returned. The fire control post was positioned near the old church, aimed toward the Volga. Sergeant Major Grunewald oversaw the position. Our forward artillery spotting post was set up in what used to be a bathhouse, once used by the Russians as both regimental and divisional headquarters before we captured it. From up there, we had a commanding view. On clear days, we could see deep across the Volga. We watched the Russians move up their artillery in broad daylight. At that point, our battery commander, Lieutenant Wüster, was still away on leave. In his absence, Lieutenant Hildebrand took over, and after he was moved up to adjutant, Lieutenant Beagle assumed command. I was stationed in the VB post, our forward observation point, as the radio operator. Every 10 days, Sergeant Major Specht and 3 others would rotate through the gully where the post sat, just 15 meters from the enemy. The lines between us and them were so close, every move had to be made through shallow communication trenches, constantly blasted by mortar fire. Our battery kept getting stripped of men. Anyone not absolutely vital was reassigned to number 1 battery, which no longer had guns and was now acting as infantry down on the river. On the 17th of December, we received the order to destroy all non-essential equipment. We took over 2 guns and marched south toward where the panzers had gathered in preparation for a breakout attempt to link up with the 4th Panzer Army. But just as we were starting to dismantle everything, the order was rescinded. We stayed. Late December into early January, Lieutenant Wüster finally returned by air. Lieutenant Beagle was reassigned to the staff battery. Our battalion command post had been moved into a former fuel factory, situated between the airfield and Red Square. Captain Langner was in command now. By early January, I had been pulled from the forward spotter post and reassigned to the battalion command post. The Volga front had gone relatively quiet, but not peaceful. We could only fire artillery at confirmed targets, and even then, just 2 or 3 shells. Meanwhile, the Russians responded with entire batteries to kill a single man. The air was bitterly cold, -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. Beautiful weather for the Russian Air Force, who circled overhead all day long. The old command office building had been converted into a field hospital, marked clearly with a red cross. The Russians bombed it anyway, setting it ablaze with phosphorus. The steppe fighting was creeping closer. Wounded men and stragglers flooded into the city's ruins. Every unit was represented now. The dead and broken wandered among the broken stones. Our surgeon, Dr. Hengst, did what he could with what little he had. We gave away what rations we could spare. It was never enough. On the 20th of January, the regimental command post was transferred to our location. Lieutenant Colonel von Stampf took charge, with Captain Schmidt as his adjutant. A week later, on the 28th, Russian forces broke through and reached the Volga south of us. We lost all contact with the southern sectors. That night, Captain Schmidt left, hoping to break out down the Volga with a small group of officers. Whether they ever made it out, I don't know. The next day, January 29th, the final scraps of the canteen stores were distributed among those left at the command post. The cold meats had already been handed out the night before. That afternoon, a lone panzer, 4, rolled into the street and opened fire on enemy infantry and mortar positions. The Russians responded with everything they had. Their artillery hammered the street. Our command post was obliterated. Lieutenant Colonel von Stampf and Captain Langner were both killed. As night fell, we abandoned what was left of the bunker and moved to a nearby cellar, already packed with survivors from other divisions, including the remnants of the fighter squadron J.G. Udet under Captain Dr. Munscheit. We had been bypassed during the fighting. Now we were trapped in our own miniature pocket, surrounded on all sides. We held out for as long as we could, but once the last of our ammunition was gone and our rifles had been smashed, there was nothing left to fight with. We surrendered on the morning of 30th January 1943. The first Russians we saw didn't steal from us. They offered us cigarettes and cigars they'd found in our captured supply warehouse. "Wojna kaput, skoro domoi," they said. "The war is over. You're going home soon." They lined up about 250 of us and marched us south with a single guard. After a short distance, the guard was relieved. That's when the looting began. Civilians and soldiers swarmed us. They tore away anything visible: watches, belts, gloves, even coats. We reached the southern road and turned toward Beketovka. A motorized Soviet unit passed us, and anyone who didn't leap out of the way fast enough was simply run over. After several kilometers, we were marched off the road to the railway line between Stalingrad and Beketovka. There we were fed a loaf of bread to be split among 8 men and 1 salted herring per head. That was our food for the next 8 days. Returning to the road, a Russian unit awaited us. Whatever we had left was stripped away. Some men lost their boots and stood barefoot in the snow at -30°C. That evening, we were herded into Beketovka camp. Thousands of prisoners crammed into gutted houses, without windows, no blankets, no bedding, just stone floors and starvation. There were 50,000 of us. The camp had 2 old captured Opel Blitz trucks. Their only job was to haul corpses to the ravines. They ran all day. There was a kitchen, but it could only serve a fraction of the men. Some were lucky to eat once a week. Most weren't. At the end of February, we were loaded into freight wagons, 80 to 100 men per car. There were plank bunks, a hole in the floor for sanitation, and a single iron stove with a blunt scrap of metal to split wood. For food, 2 slices of hard bread and another salted herring. No water. If the train stopped, the dead were dragged out and laid beside the tracks. When we finally arrived, we were split between 2 camps, Bauer and Neumann, both in the former Volga German Republic. The sick were taken on sledges pulled by oxen, led by Russian women prisoners from Bauer village. The village itself was beautiful, but its people had been deported, and now it was a prison. Of the 1,000 men housed there, 30 died per day in the early weeks. Dysentery, typhus, starvation. There was no doctor, just a single Russian nurse, helpless in the face of so much death. In March 1943, Neumann camp was shut down. The survivors were moved to Bauer. Of the 2,000 men who passed through it, only 70 able-bodied and 150 sick were still alive. I was one of them. By September, the Bauer camp was closed as well. We were sent to Volsk, survivors. Nothing more. The story of Josef Goblirsch reads like something out of a fever dream, except it was all real. In the frozen hellscape of Stalingrad, Goblirsch wasn't just fighting Soviet infantry, he was escorting spies into no man's land, fending off Mongolian stormtroops under bridge shadows, and dragging dying comrades from machine gun nests soaked in blood and phosphorus. His account offers one of the most brutal and surreal windows into the war's eastern abyss, where nothing, not orders, not honor, not even sanity, could be taken for granted. This is not fiction, this is Stalingrad, as seen through the eyes of a man who survived the end of the world. We were crouched near the water towers, buried in the dirt, our ears ringing from constant Soviet mortar fire. There was nowhere to run, no cover except the craters left by earlier shell bursts. Every breath came with dust. Stuka dive bombers howled overhead now and then, but even their fury felt like a whisper against the rock-solid resistance we were up against. At 1300 hours, the order came, dig in. That was all we could do. The Soviet 269th Infantry Regiment was in front of us, dug in and merciless. We couldn't move forward, we couldn't even look up. So we lay there like animals in those shallow holes, craters and foxholes left behind by the Russians, tending to small wounds, shielding the dead, and waiting for the dark. That night, we saw our fate coming. 10 enemy bombers rose in the east, flying straight for us. Our jaws clenched. Then from nowhere, German fighters swooped in and slashed through the formation. Half the bombers dropped in flames within seconds. The rest peeled away, still holding their payloads, and vanished east across the Volga. We would have had a perfect view if any of us had dared raise our heads above the rim of our crater, but we didn't. We were frozen in place, forgotten by our own artillery. No help, just chaos and dirt. By then, our section had taken heavy losses. Some of my comrades were already gone, others screaming and writhing in the muck. The medics were spent, staggering between bodies, working blindly in the noise and dark. Everything blurred together, shooting, leaping, digging, shouted orders, hauling wounded, dragging ammo boxes, reconnecting cut telephone lines, scarfing down a piece of bread or a swallow of bitter tea from your field flask, firing into waves of Russians charging again and again. When night finally fell, we were pulled back, relieved by a Jaeger company to give us rest, but even that word had lost its meaning. Our wheeled vehicle platoon was down to 10 barely standing men, just 30% of its original strength. The next day we found shelter in the shell of a building near the old readiness rooms on the road to Gumrak. Word reached us that Hill 102 had been hit at dawn by one of the heaviest raids yet. Dive bombers screamed down in endless waves, and Heinkels released stick after stick of bombs. Our artillery thundered over our heads toward targets around the hill and the eastern rail embankment, then rockets, then grenades, then rifles. But even with all that fire, even with all that blood, the Russians still held the hill. 2 days later, I received reinforcements. They were green boys, no combat experience. The kind that looked at you like they thought this was just another field exercise. But the battle for Hill 102 and the Northern Rail Station never slowed, and the Croats, in our division, were the only ones making headway, pushing toward the embankment. Not long after, our battalion was disbanded entirely. My company, ragged and exhausted, was folded into an assault against the northern section of the rail station. Our goal was to encircle the Russian defenders of Hill 102 from the rear. On 28th September, we launched our attack, crawling between flaming trains and twisted wrecks, advancing crater by crater. With artillery and Luftwaffe cover, we pressed forward to the so-called tennis racket, a curved loop in the railway lines. But when we captured the northern bridge, the attack halted. Too many dead, too many torn apart. We switched to defense. That same day, Hill 102 finally fell to us. We re-established contact with our isolated elements. I dug in under the northern bridge, right at the grip of the tennis racket. But it was a nightmare. The Soviets were dug into the ruins of the laser metal factory and the destroyed signal box nearby. Fighting had become house to house, crater to crater, ruin to ruin. The new orders came with updated maps. I remember Hans Moosburner, the supply sergeant, coming to me through the shrapnel-whipped gullies. He was always thinking of the horses, how to keep them alive, how to scrounge up more oats. I scribbled him a signed note authorizing a mission to collect feed from the newly taken grain silo using a cart and step pony. If the Russians had caught him with that paper, I'd have been shot on the spot or sent to Siberia for 25 years. A few days later, Corporal Franz Reckberger brought me my next orders. Reinforce and hold the Jaeger company's forward position. My right flank was Lieutenant Kuhnfels and his pioneers by the Volga. My left was Lieutenant Geisberg and his weakened 4th Jaeger company. Our battalion staff was hidden in a massive sewer pipe under the marshalling yard, 300 meters long, filled with rats and sewage, running all the way down to the Volga, and the Russians were inside it too, just meters away. The pipe was bricked off at the eastern end to keep them out. Still, I wouldn't have spent 5 minutes in that tomb. Every shell that landed near it roared through the pipe like thunder, and the stench of carbide lamps mixed with rot and human filth. No fresh air, no visibility, no hope. My own command post was just under a freight locomotive. It gave us decent cover from bullets, and we could dig easily into the loose loam beneath the tracks. I stored rifles between the rails, bored storage holes into the earth for gear, radios, and personal items. We even stretched out in those holes to sleep. No one dared build a latrine. When nature called, we used the spade. You do your business on it, toss it out, clean it with sand, and move on. A steel-roofed latrine car nearby got shredded by mortars one day. I was halfway through using it when the shells came in. I barely managed to dive under the train with my trousers still open. From my position, I had clear line of sight to the bridge, the Russian positions beyond, and the ruins of the Lasur plant. To the south, a scorched train stood at an angle, marking our boundary with Kuhnfel's men. Our snipers nested in its wreckage. Our MG teams were dug in at the bridge pillars. The Soviets came almost every night, crawling through shell holes and rubble. No tanks could reach us. Stuka craters and toppled pylons made the ground impassable, but infantry, like ghosts, slipped through. Our machine guns, the Russians called them Hitler saws, never stopped chattering. The Soviets brought up a light tank one night and parked it by the old signal box. My men asked if they should engage. I pushed our 20mm gun forward under the bridge lights. I was the loader. First shot fired. I was thrown backward by the recoil. We fired a few more, then wheeled it back just in time. Mortars rained down on us moments later. The tank didn't move. Did we kill it? We never found out. But it never fired again. Later, Rechberger returned with a weapon none of us had seen before, an anti-tank rifle with an absurdly long barrel. It needed 2 men to fire, 1 to aim, 1 to brace the shooter. I fired it myself once, maybe twice, and nearly dislocated my shoulder. We never saw what damage it did, but it made us feel like we had a fighting chance. That was all you could ask for in Stalingrad, a moment where you felt like you still had a chance, even if it was an illusion, even if it meant nothing. Because out here, buried under iron and ice, what mattered wasn't survival, it was just making it to the next hour. Full thunderclap of the explosions rolled through the industrial district like a wave of fury unleashed. The bombs fell with terrifying precision across the enemy side of the tennis racket, directly into the ruins around the signal box and the laser metal factory where we knew Russian forces had massed. The earth buckled, smoke columns rose like ghosts, and the Soviets' machine gun fire faltered. We huddled beneath steel and sandbags, each man holding his breath, hearts thumping against ribs like sledgehammers. The second group of dive bombers swept in not long after, weaving through the shrapnel cloud, fearless and magnificent. Even the Russians couldn't hold their fire steady. By the time the last Stuka wheeled away, the north side of the marshalling yard was cloaked in a dense black fog, the ground a torn landscape of jagged steel and shattered concrete. Enemy snipers had gone quiet. Their mortars stopped. No more shouting from the other side. Not for now. But no one cheered. We knew better. We'd seen it too many times before. The Russians weren't finished, not ever. They were like a tide. You could break the wave, but the water always came back. The silence afterwards was one of the worst things. A heavy, crawling silence, broken only by the twitching of metal and the occasional groan from the wounded. We used the lull to move the bodies, our own and theirs. The air reeked of blood, fuel, wet dust, and roasted meat. I oversaw Kastner's commendation paperwork that afternoon, scrawling it out while crouched beside the locomotive under fading light. His actions had saved the entire sector, and even the lieutenant had said so. We would never have held the corner bridgehead without him. Later that evening, I climbed back into the crater beneath the northern bridge. My command post, its edges sandbagged, its tunnels scraped deeper, was a fragile holdout surrounded by utter ruin. I looked up through a torn opening above the sleepers. The sky was darkening again. I thought of the young woman in white furs, her perfume still lingering faintly in my coat, her eyes unreadable, her purpose unclear. Was she the reason for the intensified barrages? Had she walked back across the ice to report every position we had? I would never know. But I did know that tomorrow we would dig again, that more would die, that some of us wouldn't see another dusk. I watched a rat scurry past, bold and fat off the dead, and felt a strange sense of calm. This place, this wrecked, bleeding shell of what once was a city, was the end of the world, the very edge of reason. And yet, every day, we woke to hold a line we could no longer define. The war had changed here. It wasn't about glory or victory anymore. It was about not giving up, about holding one more hour, one more bridge, one more breath, and when the time came, we would die where we stood, not for a Führer, not even for Germany, but for each other, for the last fragments of order in a world gone mad. The Stukas came howling down like screaming demons from the sky. Their first pass sent bombs directly into the Laser factory complex, where the Russians had fortified themselves. I grabbed the field radio and called in the strike. It was perfect, I said. Outstanding aim. But then came the second wave, larger bombs this time. As they dove, we could hear the sharp whistling just before impact, and then the entire sector vanished into flame and debris. The Russian anti-aircraft guns went mad, hurling steel upward, their shrapnel slamming into the wrecked trains around us. We were instantly swallowed in a choking fog of smoke and ash. The sky darkened, our eyes burned. The ground shook with every blast. Then came the Ju-88s, heavier payloads, no visibility. A northerly wind pushed the smoke cloud over our lines, and with it came terror. I remember thinking, they can't see anything now. They're going to drop blindly, right onto us. Every man crouched in near panic, some crying out as red flashes lit up the smoke all around. I shouted into the radio, "They're bombing too short!" But my voice was lost in the noise. Then silence, and finally a message from the air crew. "No losses. A soldier's luck to you, Herr Leutnant. Out." That was it. For days the Russians didn't attack. Artillery still pounded us, and their Katyusha rockets raked our sector. One shell tore into my locomotive, the oil tank ruptured. A thin stream of black oil trickled all the way to my trench. I was standing in it before I even realized, soaked in black sludge, my uniform ruined, my face coated like a coal miner's. There was no water to clean it off. We tore strips from Russian uniforms to wipe ourselves down. Early one morning we heard a firefight behind our lines. The stutter of Soviet machine pistols, the faster reply of ours, then grenades. They had come up through the sewer system along the Volga, lifted manhole covers near the railway station, and surrounded some of our command posts. We believed the woman in the white furs had betrayed our positions. She vanished, and shortly after, the raids intensified. Our battalion reserves repelled the sewer attack, but this sort of infiltration became daily life in Stalingrad. Then came a new horror, phosphorus shells. We heard the unfamiliar thump and saw fountains of sparks. I peeked out. The mist they left behind was glowing white, almost beautiful, until I breathed it in. My lungs seized instantly. I screamed for gas masks, but by then most had already inhaled. A soldier came running toward me, glowing with burning patches of phosphorus across his body. He reached out, his hands shining in agony, then collapsed, seizing, and died hours later beneath the locomotive. We couldn't evacuate him under the bombardment. His parents never learned how he died. By morning, most of us had burning eyes, inflamed lungs, and grey mucus pouring from our noses and mouths. Some were vomiting uncontrollably. Our feces turned to white liquid. Still, we didn't think much of it. We were used to sickness. Jaundice and hallucinations became common. I too began to shake with fever, my joints burning, and yet we thought it was just the food. Rancid butter, contaminated water, spoiled bread. On October 16th, I took a few splinters to the head and arm. Not serious. But I could no longer function properly. I hadn't shaved or washed in weeks, and now I could barely stand. So I handed the company over to my second and crawled out, intending to return in a few days. I didn't know it would be the last time I'd see that trench. As I walked toward the railway station, a Soviet Il-2 roared out of the sun and attacked a nearby flak gun. On the town square, I hit the dirt between tram rails, lucky to avoid the splinters. The aircraft made a final pass and was hit. It exploded into fire mid-air, one wing spiraling down like a leaf. I passed a burnt-out Russian tank on Red Square. At the regimental post, a weary surgeon gave me an injection and told me to report to the dressing station at Gumrak. Gumrak was a vision from hell. Severed limbs stacked high, doused in chemicals. Rats gnawed at the wounded. Surgeons slept on their feet, slicing open one man and moving to the next. I saw men with stomach wounds drugged and dumped on floors. My own wounds were cleaned and bandaged, though I was still feverish, my guts wrecked. My diarrhea had worsened, my chest ached. I vomited everything I tried to eat. Then came word. An ambulance Ju-52 was leaving, marked with the Red Cross. I was loaded aboard, packed in with groaning, frozen wounded. Just after we crossed the Don, 3 IL-2s intercepted us. We had no tail gunner. The pilot yelled for anyone trained to man the MG. I climbed over the wounded, heart hammering, and loaded the belt with trembling hands. I fired as they came close, but my first bursts missed. One of them peeled off. Another came in, and I let off a long burst. I saw sparks bounce off his belly. He turned away. The third didn't even try. After the final pass, they disappeared. I was frozen solid. The pilot praised me, but I collapsed where I stood. We landed at Taganrog on the Black Sea, where a hospital train waited. I was loaded aboard, still sick, still in pain, my body trembling with cold and exhaustion. I vomited after every attempt to eat. I barely remember the journey, but I remember Stalingrad, the girl in white furs, the phosphorus burns, the stink of oil and blood, the rats, the screaming, the endless cold. I remember the sound of shovels scraping frozen ground, not to build trenches, but to dig graves. He was there until the very end. Dietrich Goldbeck wasn't just a witness to Stalingrad's collapse. He stood in its final bunker, surrounded by frostbitten comrades, listening to the Nibelungenlied echo from a dying radio as the walls shook under Soviet shellfire. His unit held the line with almost no ammunition, dragging supplies on sleds by night and burying the dead until even that became impossible. In the last hours, they destroyed their weapons, cooked their final rations, and prepared to fall, not in battle, but into captivity. Goldbeck's account is not just the story of a soldier, it is the voice of the last breath of a lost army. By the time the Russians broke through the northeast corner of the Don River Bend in late November 1942, we already sensed a shift. It was between the 19th and 21st when the hammer finally fell, first at Beketovka and then further south near Krasnoarmysk. Their encirclement of 6th Army began, and our 160th Anti-Tank Battalion received new orders. My first company, under Lieutenant Mal, had dug in our 5-centimeter guns into hardened positions that overlooked the divisional sector from the north, just above the railway line running from Gumrak east to the tractor works. The other two companies, equipped with heavier 7.62-centimeter self-propelled guns, were positioned further back, their steel hidden beneath frozen camouflage nets and heated gun bunkers, just waiting for the order to move. We set up our command post in a gully about 2 kilometers south of the rail line, near the main divisional battle HQ. Everything was calm, eerily so. The ground was iron beneath our boots, and every day we chipped away at new bunkers and winter trenches, even as we eyed the snow clouds gathering over the steppe. Leave had recently been granted. It had been over 20 months since most of the men had seen home, and the steady trickle of lucky ones lifted morale. Of course, jaundice had ripped through us like a scythe in the autumn, and I myself had been laid up for most of October. When the last battle began, we were hollowed out. I doubt we were even 300 strong at full count. I'd say perhaps 280, maybe less. In December, I joined the reconnaissance team to scout possible routes for a breakout. Back then, we still believed in miracles. I remember seeing heavy panzers with naval cannons welded to them, some bizarre 12.5 and 10.8 centimeter guns mounted onto tracked hulls. They looked monstrous, absurd, but they filled us with hope. Still, in our northern sector, everything was deathly still. Unlike the Western Front, where the Soviets tested our lines almost daily with tanks, we were left to our building and waiting. The OT engineers behind us kept digging, laying new trenches, trying to deepen the lines. Through the static, our radios still picked up chatter from units outside the pocket, returning leave takers, convalescents now stationed at Stalino. Most of us never thought we'd see the new year from inside the cauldron. No one imagined the encirclement would hold. On Christmas Eve, we were filled with expectation, even joy. Major Ryman toured every gun position with cigarettes, chocolate, and a nip of brandy. That night, we crammed into our bunker beside a small tree and tried to forget the grimness outside. Some letters arrived, and when the cathedral bells rang faintly through the radio, a hush came over us. For a few hours, it felt like we were back in another world. The Hiwis, our Russian auxiliaries, remained oddly steadfast. They chopped wood, maintained vehicles, did laundry, all for scraps of food. They knew we were surrounded, yet they showed no signs of rebellion. In fact, their worst fear was being released. They didn't want to be left behind. On Christmas Eve, I gathered a few of them and offered cigarettes and captured Machorka. One of them looked me dead in the eyes and said he knew the truth, that we were finished, but still, he wanted to stay with us. That night, they invited me into their little shelter and sang their songs, their voices like ghosts drifting across the snow. But Christmas night shattered everything. A violent Soviet assault smashed into the right flank of our division. They broke through. We patched it desperately, bloodily, losing ground and men. The next days blurred into each other. Bitter wind, constant barrages, trenches lost, recaptured, then lost again. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, sanity. Our third company was eventually dissolved. Its few survivors folded into the other two. Lieutenant Kreutzberg, his face blank, was sent to the rear to help scrape together food for the rest of us. But by January 10th, when the Soviets launched their final major offensive, it didn't matter anymore. Even our solid trenches couldn't hold. After Pitomnik fell, the Western Front collapsed toward Gumrak, and we were forced to abandon everything we'd built. Our command post moved to the so-called Tatar Wall east of Gumrak. It was there that Major Ryman returned from a commander's conference, his eyes dark, his mouth flat. "We're alone," he said quietly. Kalmyk stepped between us and the front. 300 kilometers, maybe more. The Caucasus might already be lost. I tried to deny it. I told him we'd hold. We always had, but in my gut I knew. Despite the hopelessness setting in, the men still fought with a fire that defied reason. Supplies dwindled, ammunition had to be carried on foot. The wounded piled into bunkers, shaking with cold and pain, begging for morphine. Rearward units fought rearguard actions to buy time for us. Lieutenant Flieger, the supply officer, led a ragged defense with cooks, smiths and mechanics. They fought off an entire Russian patrol and saved our last stocks of fuel and munitions. He earned the Iron Cross for that. By early February, we had been pushed to the edge, literally. In a narrow gully west of the Barricadi factory ruins, we held the final line. Makeshift bunkers hacked into the snow by logistics troops were all we had left. Around us, the pocket had splintered into 3 isolated segments. Ours was in the north, under General Strecker. The last days were beyond description. Wounded men were left in the snow to freeze. The hungry collapsed in drifts and never rose again. We still clung to our guns. Some of them froze, others jammed. But when the Soviets came, we fired. Every last man. No one escaped frostbite. No one avoided wounds. In our last attack, I remember leaning against a snowbank, rifle across my knees, my hands trembling. The enemy kept coming, and still, we fired. Our final command post was in a shared bunker near the 92nd Motorized Infantry Regiment. A few vehicles still moved, but one by one, they were destroyed. The last airfield had fallen. At night, transport planes circled overhead, dropping bundles, sometimes to us, sometimes to the Russians. There was no longer a front, just pockets of men, frozen in place, buried beneath snow and smoke, waiting for the end, and somehow still believing that help would come. In those last days, you couldn't move in daylight. The ring around us had become so tight that even a single step above ground was enough to draw fire. Every shell, every bullet, felt like it had your name on it. Ammunition was nearly gone. A few of our anti-tank guns still had rounds, but not many, and most were silent now, either destroyed or useless, without shells. We were reduced to counting bullets, holding each one like a lifeline. At night, a few men dragged sledges into the gully, hauling bread, ammunition, anything. Sometimes it was just a few tins, sometimes only snow to melt. It was survival, hour by hour. On the 30th of January, it began. A storm of shellfire, the worst yet. The sky tore open, our trenches vanished under smoke and screaming metal. Inside the bunker, we heard the Wehrmacht receiver crackle to life. Southern and central pockets had surrendered. They were gone. Then, as if to usher us into the abyss, they played the song of the Nibelungen. I just sat there, staring at the wall. I couldn't believe it was over. Until that point, we had buried every man who fell in our sector, even if it was just wrapping them in a blanket and pushing them beneath the snow. But that stopped too. Now the shells came down in patterns. One after another, 7.62 centimeter anti-tank shells hammered our roof. Somehow, our bunker held. We couldn't reach the wounded anymore. The last field kitchen was hit, splintered into charred iron. Food was cooked in shifts, passed in battered tins down the line. On February 1st, the Soviets attacked again, twice. They shelled us first, then came with tanks and waves of men. KV-1s, ghost-like, glided between snowdrifts, invisible until they were nearly on top of us. But we held. We threw back their attack with our last strength, and when the smoke cleared, We could see their losses, so many dead, frozen in the snow, rifles still clutched in their hands. But it was done. That night, the division sent out its final order: destroy all weapons, offer no resistance. The end had come, and strangely, the night was quiet. Not peaceful, just empty. A machine gun crackled once or twice in the distance. We shared what little we had left. What food, what warmth, what words we could offer each other. We cooked, one last time. We burned every paper, and one by one, we laid down our weapons. They played that song all night, over and over, the death march of the Nibelungen, as if the past itself was saluting us before it disappeared forever. Just before dawn, the men from the forward trenches came back. They wanted to be with us for the end. They didn't want to die alone. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? Around 6 in the morning, we saw them, lines of Soviet infantry coming through the snow. No shots were fired. A white cloth fluttered from the 92nd bunker. The Russians wore white smocks and carried their machine pistols like scythes. When they reached us, they shouted orders in harsh, guttural Russian. I smashed the radio with a hatchet, then followed the others out. One of the last to leave the bunker. Outside, there were maybe 70 of us. Many were wounded, limping or holding frostbitten limbs wrapped in rags. We stood in silence, just breathing, just existing. Then the commander of our Abteilung stepped forward, raised his hand in one final salute. We stood there, unmoving, as he looked at each of us in turn. And that was it. February 2nd, 1943. That was the end of our anti-tank battalion. That was the end of everything. What happened after the guns went silent in Stalingrad was not peace, but something far colder, far more unforgiving. For the shattered remnants of the once proud 6th Army, surrender was not the end of suffering. It was only the beginning of a new kind of torment. When the Soviet forces began collecting prisoners in early February 1943, they faced a grim dilemma. The Red Army and their civilian population were themselves starving. Many soldiers were underfed. Entire families across Russia had gone without bread for weeks. So the thought of feeding captured German invaders, men who had burned villages, looted homes, and brought unimaginable destruction, felt like an insult to every grieving Soviet mother. There was a fierce reluctance to even spare a crust of bread. For many German prisoners, rations didn't arrive for days. By then, they'd eaten almost nothing in nearly 2 weeks. What finally came was pitiful. A loaf of bread for 10 men, a watery soup floating with a few grains of millet and maybe a salted fish. For the wounded, there was no exception. Hunger became a slow death sentence, and yet hunger was not the greatest fear. In the minds of doctors trapped in the Kessel, it was disease, particularly typhus, that haunted their thoughts. They'd seen the first cases emerge, but dared not speak aloud, fearing they'd spark mass panic. The tunnel hospitals tried to isolate cases, diphtheria here, typhus there, but there were no delousing stations. Many of the Soviet soldiers and local civilians were themselves crawling with lice. It was only a matter of time. Thousands died, drained of the will to live. The hope of returning home felt more like a myth than a possibility. Germany was now a far-off dream, and for many, death came gently, even mercifully, not in agony, but in apathy, a silent drift into the abyss. Yet a few refused to go quietly. Some clung to life out of sheer stubbornness, others through religion, or the simple thought of one day seeing their wife or child again. It was these men, those who refused to die in filth, that had a chance. A small one, but the march into captivity was just as brutal as the battle. What followed the surrender were the infamous death marches, columns of men, described by survivors as ghosts in rags, limped through the ruins of Russia. Temperatures dropped to -30. There was no food, no water, no shelter. Some marched for 5 days straight, stopping only to sleep in snowbanks or inside the ruins of buildings they themselves had bombed. Shots cracked through the frozen air. The slow, the wounded, the sick, any who couldn't walk, were executed or simply abandoned. Men collapsed into snowdrifts and never rose again. Their comrades, too weak to help, simply shuffled on. The columns were like funeral processions for the living. Some tried to stay awake in the night by taking turns, jogging in circles or standing like horses under a single blanket to share body heat. But each morning, there were more dead. One German unit marched out 1,200 men. Only 120 made it to Beketovka alive. That place, Beketovka, became a name of terror, a gateway to hell. The camp received over 50,000 prisoners in days. Soviet officers admitted the situation was extremely critical. There was no proper transport. Camels pulled carts of water in barrels. The prisoners were forced to sleep 40 to a room. Lice swarmed over their bodies. Dysentery, typhus, and starvation tore through the huts. A doctor reported a wall of corpses stacked 6 feet high, 100 yards long. They called it the Mountain of Bodies. Some days, 60 prisoners died. Every morning, frozen bodies were dragged out like garbage. One Austrian doctor wrote, "Nothing to eat, nothing to drink. Filthy snow and urine-yellow ice offered the only relief for an unbearable thirst." Cannibalism became a last resort. Thin strips of flesh cut from frozen corpses were boiled and passed off as camel meat. Men who ate it turned red in the face, a mark of shame or of survival. Soviet guards tried to stop it at gunpoint, but by then, the hunger had become stronger than fear. Dysentery drowned men in the latrines. The stink was unbearable, the filth inescapable. But even in such misery, strange moments of humanity appeared. One young aristocrat, once a wealthy count, was recognized by a peasant soldier who used to see him drive by in a red sports car. "If you're hungry," the peasant said, "maybe I can help." He'd been working in the camp hospital and shared leftover bread crusts. That simple act saved the count's life, yet survival often came down to pure biology. The large, muscular men, the ones who once seemed invincible, died first. The thin and wiry were the most likely to endure. The food rations didn't scale. A towering man and a 120-pound farmer got the same sliver of bread. In this reversed world, smallness became strength. As spring arrived, the Soviets began shipping prisoners across the country. The generals went first, riding in padded, comfortable carriages. Rank had its privilege. These were the same men who'd once barked "fight to the last bullet." Now they sipped tea and rode east. For ordinary soldiers, the journey was hell. They were packed 100 to a train wagon, one hole in the floor for a toilet. No food, no water, just dry bread, salt fish, and the hope they wouldn't freeze. Some trains took 25 days to reach their destinations. In one wagon, only 8 men survived. Men licked frost off the walls to stay alive. Others died silently in the night, their corpses stacked near the door to be thrown out at the next stop. Soviet guards barked, "Skolko kaput?" How many dead? Those who survived were sent to places like Bekabad near Tashkent or Oranki near Gorky. Conditions varied. Some prisoners found themselves digging dams beneath the Pamir Mountains. Some were shaved like livestock, deloused with poisonous powder and dumped into earthen bunkers. Others encountered German turncoats working as Soviet guards, crueler than any Russian, according to survivors. A few lucky ones made it to camps like Chwama, where they found better conditions, even a swimming pool. Italians there hunted sparrows for soup, but the worst remained in Stalingrad itself. They were forced to drag wrecked boats from the Volga, clean rubble, and bury the dead. Even as the city was rebuilt, the first building restored was the NKVD headquarters, the Soviet secret police. German prisoners watched as lines of women formed outside, bringing food to loved ones arrested by Stalin's regime. One German soldier said, "We knew we'd be prisoners there for a long, long time." And they were. Most would not see home again for 10 years. For tens of thousands, that homecoming never came at all. What you have just seen was only a glimpse into the suffering endured by tens of thousands of men who marched into Stalingrad and never came back. These weren't just soldiers. They were sons, brothers, fathers, human beings who, in their final moments, were stripped of everything: warmth, dignity, even their names, reduced to numbers, stacked in silence beneath the snow. It's easy to talk about war in terms of strategy, victories, and losses, but behind every statistic is a face, a voice, a story that deserves to be remembered. I'm glad I could share this with you today, not to glorify war, but to remind us of its terrible cost. If this story moved you, if you believe these men should never be forgotten, then please subscribe to the channel. It helps keep their memories alive, and it helps me keep bringing you the untold human side of history that so often gets lost in the noise. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. What struck you most? And if you'd like to support the channel even further, consider sharing this video with someone who needs to see it. And big thanks to my Patreons. You can find more of me below. Thank you for watching. I will catch you in the next adventure.